Look, equality of welfare. 1. Two theories of equality. Equality is a popular but mysterious political ideal. People can become equal, or at least more equal, in one way, with the consequence that they become unequal or more unequal in others. If people have equal income, for example, they will almost certainly differ in the amount of satisfaction they find in their lives. It does not follow, of course, that equality is worthless as an ideal, but it is necessary to state, more exactly than is commonly done, what form of equality is finally important. This is not a linguistic or even conceptual question. It does not call for a definition of the word equal or an analysis of how that word is used in ordinary language. It requires that we distinguish various conceptions of equality in order to decide which of these conceptions, or which combination, states an attractive political ideal, if any does. That exercise may be described somewhat differently, using a distinction I have drawn in other contexts. There is a difference between treating people equally with respect to one another commodity or opportunity, and treating them as equals. Someone who argues that people should be more equal in income claims that a community that achieves equality of income is one that really treats people as equals. Someone who urges that people should instead be equally happy offers a different and competing theory about what society deserves that title. The question is then, which of the many different theories of that sort is the best theory? In this chapter and the next, I discuss one aspect of that question, which might be called the problem of distributional equality. Suppose some community must choose between alternative schemes for distributing money and other resources to individuals. Which of the possible schemes treats people as equals? This is only one aspect of the more general problem of equality, because it sets aside a variety of issues that might be called, by way of contrast, issues about political equality. Distributional equality, as I describe it, is not concerned with the distribution of political power, for example, or with individual rights other than rights to some amount or share of resources. It is obvious, I think, that these questions I throw together under the label of political equality are not so independent from issues of distributional equality as the distinction might suggest. Someone who can play no role in determining, for example, whether an environment he cherishes should be preserved from pollution is poorer than someone who can play an important role in that decision. But it nevertheless seems likely that a full theory of equality, embracing a range of issues including political and distributional equality, is best approached by accepting initial, even though somewhat arbitrary, distinctions among these issues. I shall consider two general theories of distributional equality. The first, which I call equality of welfare, holds that a distributional scheme treats people as equals when it distributes or transfers resources among them until no further transfer would leave them more equal in welfare. The second, equality of resources, holds that it treats them as equals when it distributes or transfers so that no further transfer would leave their shares of the total resources more equal. Each of these two theories, as I have just stated them, is very abstract because, as we shall see, there are many different interpretations of what welfare is, and also different theories about what would count as equality of resources. Nevertheless, even in this abstract form, it should be plain that the two theories will offer different advice in many concrete cases. Suppose, for example, that a man of some wealth has several children, one of whom is blind, another a playboy with expensive tastes, a third a prospective politician with expensive ambitions, another a poet with humble needs, another a sculptor who works in expensive material, and so forth. How shall he draw his will? If he takes equality of welfare as his goal, then he will take these differences among his children into account, so that he will not leave them equal shares. Of course, he will have to decide on some interpretation of welfare and whether, for example, expensive tastes should figure in his calculations in the same way as handicaps or expensive ambitions. But if, on the contrary, he takes equality of resources as his goal, then, assuming his children have roughly equal wealth already, he may well decide that his goal requires an equal division of his wealth. In any case, the questions he will put to himself will then be very different. It is true that the distinction between the two abstract theories will be less clear-cut in an ordinary political context, particularly when officials have very little information about the actual tastes and ambitions of particular citizens. If a welfare egalitarian knows nothing of this sort about a large group of citizens, he may sensibly decide that his best strategy for securing equality of welfare would be to establish equality of income. But the theoretical difference between the two abstract theories of equality nevertheless remains important in politics for a variety of reasons. Officials often do have sufficient general information about the distribution of tastes and handicaps to justify general adjustments to equality of resources, for example, by special tax allowances, if their goal is equality of welfare. Even when they do not, some economic structures they might devise would be antecedently better calculated to reduce inequality of welfare under conditions of uncertainty, and others to reduce inequality of resources. But the main importance of the issue I now raise is theoretical. Egalitarians must decide whether the equality they seek is equality of resources or welfare, or some combination or something very different, in order plausibly to argue that equality is worth having at all. I do not mean that only pure egalitarians need take any interest in this question, for even those who do not think that equality is the whole story in political morality usually concede that it is part of the story, so that it is at least a point in favor of some political arrangement, even if not decisive or even central, that it reduces inequality. People who assign equality even this modest weight must nevertheless identify what counts as equality. I must emphasize, however, that the two abstract conceptions of equality I shall consider do not exhaust the possible theories of equality, even in combination. There are other important theories that can be captured only artificially by either of these. Several philosophers, for example, hold meritocratic theories of distributional equality, some of which appeal to what is often called equality of opportunity. This claim takes different forms, but one prominent form holds that people are denied equality when their superior position in either welfare or resources is counted against them in the competition for university places or jobs, for example. Nevertheless, the claims of both equality of welfare and equality of resources are both familiar and apparent, and it is these that I shall consider. In this chapter, I examine and on the whole reject various versions of the former claim. In chapter 2, I shall develop and endorse a particular version of the latter. I might perhaps add two more caveats. It is widely believed that certain people, for example criminals, do not deserve distributional equality. I do not consider that question, though I do raise some questions about merit or desert in considering what distributional equality is. John Rawls, among others, has questioned whether distributional equality might not require deviations from an equal base when this is in the interests of the then worst off group, so that, for example, equality of welfare is best served when the worst off have less welfare than others, but more than they would otherwise have. I discuss this claim in the next chapter with respect to equality of resources, but not in this one, where I propose that equality in welfare is not a desirable political goal even when inequality in welfare would not improve the position of the worst off. 2. A first look. There is an immediate appeal in the idea that insofar as equality is important, it must ultimately be equality of welfare that counts. For the concept of welfare was invented or at least adopted by economists precisely to describe what is fundamental in life rather than what is merely instrumental. It was adopted, in fact, to provide a metric for assigning a proper value to resources. Resources are valuable so far as they produce welfare. If we decide, donc, faut mieux traduire welfare par bien-être. If we decide on equality, but then define equality in terms of resources unconnected with the welfare they bring, then we seem to be mistaking means for ends and indulging a fetishistic fascination for what we ought to treat only as instrumental. If we want genuinely to treat people as equals, or so it may seem, then we must contrive to make their lives equally desirable to them or give them the means to do so, not simply to make the figures in their bank accounts the same. This immediate attraction of equality of welfare is supported by one aspect of the domestic example I described. When the question arises how wealth should be distributed among children, for example, those who are seriously physically or mentally handicapped do seem to have, in all fairness, a claim to more than others. The ideal of equality of welfare may seem a plausible explanation of why this is so. Because they are handicapped, the blind need more resources to achieve equal welfare. But the same domestic example also provides at least an initially troublesome problem for that ideal, for most people would resist the conclusion that those who have expensive tastes are, for that reason, entitled to a larger share than others. Someone with champagne tastes, as we might describe his condition, also needs more resources to achieve welfare equal to those who prefer beer. But it does not seem fair that he should have more resources on that account. The case of the prospective politician, who needs a great deal of money to achieve his ambitions to do good, or the ambitious sculptor, who needs more expensive materials than the poet, perhaps falls in between. Their case for a larger share of their parents' resources seems stronger than the case of the child with expensive tastes, but weaker than the case of the child who is blind. The question therefore arises whether the ideal of equality in welfare can be accepted in part as an ideal that has a place, but not the only place, in general theory of equality. The theory as a whole might then provide that the handicapped must have more resources because their welfare will otherwise be lower than it could be, but not the men of champagne tastes. There are a number of ways in which that compromise within the idea of equality might be constructed. We might, for example, accept that in principle social resources should be distributed so that people are as equal in welfare as possible, but provide, by way of exception, that no account should be taken of differences in welfare traceable to certain sources, such as differences in tastes for drink. That gives equality of welfare the dominant place, but it prunes the ideal of certain distinct and unappealing consequences. Or we might, as the other extreme, accept only that differences in welfare from certain specified sources, such as handicaps, should be minimized. On this account, equality of welfare would play only a part, perhaps a very minor part, in any general theory of equality, whose main political force must then come from a very different direction. I shall postpone until later in this chapter the question of how far such compromises or combinations or qualifications are in fact available and attractive, and also postpone until then consideration of the particular problems of expensive tastes and handicaps. But I want to single out and set aside in advance one form of objection of the feasibility of compromises of equality of welfare. It might be objected against any such compromise that the concept of welfare is insufficiently clear to permit the necessary distinctions. We cannot tell, it might be said, how much any welfare differences between two people who have equal wealth are in fact traceable to differences in the cost of their tastes, or in the adequacy of their physical or mental powers, for example. So any theory that embraces equality of welfare must pay attention to people's welfare as a whole rather than welfare derived or lost through any particular source. Obviously, there is much in this sort of objection, though how strong the objection is must depend on the form of compromise proposed. I want, however, to set aside all objections about the feasibility of distinguishing welfare sources. I also want to set aside the moral general objection that the concept of welfare is itself, even apart from distinctions as to source, too vague or too impractical to provide the basis of any theory of equality. I said earlier then that there are many different interpretations or conceptions of welfare, and that a theory of equality of welfare that uses one of these will have very different consequences and will require a very different theoretical support from a theory that uses another. Some philosophers think of welfare as a matter of pleasure or enjoyment or some other conscious state, for example, while others think of it as success in achieving one's plans. We shall later have to identify the leading conceptions of welfare and look at the different conceptions of equality of welfare they supply. But we may notice in advance that each of the familiar conceptions of welfare raises obvious conceptual and practical problems about testing and comparing the welfare levels of different people. Each of them has the consequence that comparisons of welfare will often be indeterminate. It will often be the case that of two people neither will have less welfare, but that their welfare will not be equal. It does not follow, however, that the ideal of equality of welfare, on any interpretation, is either incoherent or useless, but that ideal states the political principle that, so far as is possible, no one should have less welfare than anyone else. If that principle is sound, then the ideal of equality of welfare may sensibly leave open the practical problem of how decisions should be made when the comparison of welfare makes sense but its result is unclear. It may also sensibly concede that there will be several cases in which the comparison is even theoretically pointless. Provided these cases are not too numerous, the ideal remains both practically and theoretically important. 3. Conceptions of equality of welfare. Ah, mais peut-être qu'elle vient. Merde! Pardon. There are several theories in the field about what welfare is, and therefore several conceptions of equality of welfare. I shall divide what I consider the most prominent and plausible such theories into two main groups, without, however, supposing that all the theories in the literature can fit comfortably into one or the other. The first group I shall call success theories. The first group I shall call success theories of welfare. These suppose that a person's welfare is a matter of his success in fulfilling his preferences, goals, and ambitions, and so equality of success, as a conception of equality of welfare, recommends distribution and transfer of resources until no further transfer can decrease the extent to which people differ in such success. But since people have different sorts of preferences, different versions of equality of success are in principle available. People have first what I shall call political preferences, though I use that term in a way that is both narrower and more extended than the way it is often used. I mean preferences about how the goods, resources, and opportunities of the community should be distributed to others. These preferences may be either formal political theories of the familiar sort, such as the theory that goods should be distributed in accordance with merit or desert, or more informal preferences that are not theories at all, such as the preference many people have that those that they like or feel special sympathy for should have more than others. Second, people have what I shall call impersonal preferences, which are preferences about things other than their own or other people's lives or situations. Some people care very much about the advance of scientific knowledge, for example, even though it will not be they or any person they know who will make the advance, while others care equally deeply about the conservation of certain kinds of beauty they will never see. Third, people have what I shall call personal preferences, by which I mean their preferences about their own experiences or situation. I do not deny that these types of preferences might overlap, or that some preferences will resist classification into any of the three categories. Fortunately, my arguments will not require the contrary assumption. Okay. The most unrestricted form of equality of success that I shall consider holds that redistribution should continue until, so far this is possible, people are equal in the degree to which all their various preferences are fulfilled. I shall then consider the more restricted version that only non-political preferences should be counted in this calculation, and then the still more restricted version that only personal preferences should count. More complex versions of equality of success, which combine the satisfaction of some but not all preferences from the different groups, are of course available, though I hope that the arguments I make will not require me to identify and consider such combinations. Bonjour. The second class of theories of welfare I shall call conscious state theories. Equality of welfare linked to that sort of theory holds that distribution should attempt to leave people as equal as possible in some aspect or quality of their conscious life. Different conceptions of that ideal are constructed by choosing different accounts or descriptions of the state in question. Bentham and other early utilitarians took welfare to consist in pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Equality of welfare, so conceived, would require distribution that tended to make people equal in their balance of pleasure over pain. But most utilitarians and other partisans of the conscious state conception of welfare believe that pleasure and pain are much too narrow to represent the full range of conscious states that should be included. For example, pleasure, which suggests a specific kind of sensuous glow, poorly describes the experience produced by a harrowing piece of drama or poetry, and experience people nevertheless sometimes aim to have, and pain does not easily capture boredom or unease or depression. I do not wish to discuss the issues this dispute raises. Instead, I shall use the words enjoyment and dissatisfaction indiscriminately to name the full range of desirable and undesirable conscious states or emotions that any version of a conscious state conception of equality of welfare might suppose to matter. This usage gives those words, of course, a broader sense than they have in ordinary language, but I intend that broad sense, provided only that they must name conscious states that people might aim to have or avoid for their own sakes, and states that are introspectively identifiable. 2 seconds. Hmm. Wait. People often gain enjoyment or suffer dissatisfaction directly from sensuous stimulation through sex or food or sun or cold or steel. But they also gain enjoyment or suffer dissatisfaction through the fulfillment or defeat of their preferences of different sorts. So there are unrestricted and restricted versions of the conscious state conception of equality of welfare, parallel to the versions I distinguished of conceptions of equality of success. One version aims to make people more equal in enjoyment without restriction as to source, another only in the enjoyment they take directly and from non-political preferences, and another in the enjoyment they take directly and from personal preferences only. As in the case of equality of success, more discriminating versions that combine enjoyment from subdivisions of these different sorts of preferences are also available. I shall also consider, though only very briefly, a third class of conceptions of equality of welfare, which I shall call objective conceptions. Many subdivisions and further classifications among these three classes of conceptions, beyond those I have just noticed, would have to be considered in any full account of possible theories of welfare, and there are theories of welfare not represented in this list at all. But these seem the most plausible candidates for constructing theories of distribution. I shall just mention, however, two sorts of complexities that we should at least bear in mind. First, many of the conceptions and versions I have distinguished raise the question of whether equality in that conception is reached when people are in fact equal in welfare so conceived, or rather when they would be equal if they were fully informed of the relevant facts. Does someone attain a given level of success for purposes of equality of success when he believes that his preferences have been fulfilled to a given degree, or rather when he would believe that if he knew the facts? I shall try, when questions of that sort may affect the argument, either to discuss both possibilities or to assume the version that seems to me in context more plausible. Second, many of the conceptions I shall discuss raise problems about time. People's preferences change, for example, so that the question of how far someone's preferences for his life have been fulfilled overall will depend on which set of his preferences is chosen as relevant, or which function of the different preferences he has at different times. I do not believe that any of these temporal problems affect the various points that I shall make, but readers who do should consider whether my arguments hold against alternate versions. There is, however, a further preliminary question that must detain us longer. We can distinguish two different questions. One, is someone's overall welfare, his essential well-being, really just a matter of the amount of his success in fulfilling his preferences, or just a matter of his enjoyment? Two, does distributional equality really require aiming to leave people equal in that success or enjoyment? The first of these questions takes a certain view of the connection between theories of welfare, such as those I described, and the concept of welfare itself. It supposes that this connection is rather like the connection between theories or conceptions of justice and the concept of justice itself. We agree that justice is an important moral and political ideal, and we ask ourselves which of the different theories about what justice actually consists in is the best such theory. So we might suppose that, for one or another purpose, the welfare of persons, conceived as their essential well-being, is an important moral and political concept, and they ask ourselves which of the traditional theories or new theories we might deploy is the best theory of what welfare, so conceived, actually is. But the second question does not in itself require that we confront or even acknowledge the sense of that last question. We may believe that genuine equality requires that people be made equal in their success or enjoyment, without believing that essential well-being, properly understood, is just a matter of success or enjoyment. We may indeed believe that equality requires equality in success, even if we are skeptical about the whole idea of essential well-being, considered to be a deep or further fact about people conceptually independent from their success or enjoyment. That is, we may accept equality of success as an attractive political ideal, even if we reject the very sense of the question whether two people who are equal in success are equal in essential well-being. And we may do so even if we deny that this question is analogous to the question whether producing the highest possible average utility makes an institution just. I make these remarks because it is important to distinguish between two strategies that someone anxious to defend a particular conception of equality of welfare might use. He might begin first by accepting the idea of welfare as essential well-being, and then take as at least the tentative premise of his argument the proposition that genuine equality requires people to be equal in essential well-being. He might then argue for a particular theory of welfare, success for example, as the best theory of what essential well-being consists in, and so conclude that equality requires that people be made equal in success. Or second, he might argue for some conception of equality of welfare, such as equality of success, in a more direct way. He might take no position on the question whether essential well-being consists in success, or even on the prior question whether that question makes sense. He might argue that, in any case, equality of success is required for reasons of fairness, or for some other reasons having to do with the analysis of equality that are independent of any theory about the sense or content of essential well-being. Is it therefore necessary to consider both of these strategies in assessing the case for any particular conception of equality of welfare? I think not, because the defeat of the second strategy, at least in a certain way, must count as a defeat of the first as well. I do not mean myself to claim that the idea of essential well-being, as a concept admitting of different conceptions, is nonsense, so that the first strategy, short of nonsense, is just the second. On the contrary, I think that idea, at least as defined by certain contexts, is an important one, and the question of where a person's essential well-being lies, when properly conceived, is sometimes, in those contexts, a question of profound importance. Nor do I think it follows from the conclusion that people should not be made equal in some particular conception of welfare, that this is a poor conception of welfare conceived as essential well-being. I mean rather to deny something like the opposite claim, that if some conception is a good conception of welfare, it follows that people should be made equal in welfare so conceived. This does not follow. I might accept, for example, that people are equal in essential well-being when each is roughly equally successful in achieving a certain set of his preferences, without thereby considering that an advance toward that situation is even pro tanto an advance toward genuine distributional equality. Even if I initially accept both propositions, I should abandon the latter if I am then persuaded that there are good reasons of political morality for not making people equal in that sort of success, and that these reasons hold whether or not the former proposition is sound. So many arguments capable of defeating the second strategy, by showing that there are strong reasons of political morality why distribution should not aim to make people equal in success, must also count as strong arguments against the first strategy, though not, of course, as arguments defeating the interim conclusion of that strategy. That essential well-being consists in success. In what follows, I shall try to oppose the second strategy in this manner. 4. Success theories. I want now to examine equality of welfare conceived in the various ways I have described, beginning with the group of theories I called success theories. As I said, I do not intend to make much of the practical difficulties, as such, of applying these or any other conceptions of equality of welfare. If any society dedicated itself to achieving any version of equality of success or of enjoyment, it could do at best only a rough job and could have only a rough idea of how well it was doing. Some differences in success would be beyond the reach of political action, and some could be eliminated only by procedures too expensive of other values. Equality of welfare, so conceived, could be taken only as the ideal of equality, to be used as a standard for deciding which of different practical political arrangements seemed most or least likely to advance that idea on the whole as a matter of antecedent tendency. But precisely for that reason, it is important to test the different conceptions of equality of welfare as ideals. Our question is, if impossibly we could achieve equality of welfare in some one of these conceptions, would it be desirable, in the name of equality, to do so? Political preferences. I shall begin by considering equality of success in the widest and most unrestricted sense I distinguished, that is, equality in the fulfillment of people's preferences when these include political as well as other forms of preferences. très mal. Excusez-moi. Ouais, désolée, si, mais en fait, j'étais en train de regarder les billets, Paris-Lorient parce que mon père, veut qu'on parte, enfin que je parte entre le 20 et le 23 voir les billets les moins chers, tu vois? Que je le rejoigne en Bretagne. Ouais, les Anglais. Bah, du coup, je verrai ça plus tard. C'est Webton, en fait, tout à l'heure. Mais du coup, je sais plus où j'en étais en plus. Hem, non, au début, en fait. Ouais, c'est ça. Their political preferences. I shall begin by considering equality of success in the widest and most unrestricted sense I distinguished, that is, equality in the fulfillment of people's preferences when these include political as well as other forms of preferences. D'accord. We should notice. Alors, ça, j'ai jamais compris comment ce. Je retiens jamais comment ce mot se prononce. Est-ce que c'est threshold ou threshold? Seuil. Difficulty in applying this conception of equality in a community in which some people themselves hold, as a matter of their own political preferences, exactly the same theory. Officials could not know whether such a person's political preferences were fulfilled until they knew whether the distribution fulfilled everyone's preferences equally, including his political preferences, and there is danger of a circle here. But I shall assume that equality of welfare, so conceived, might be reached in such a society by trial and error. Resources might be distributed and redistributed until everyone pronounced himself satisfied that equality of success on the widest conception had been achieved. We should also notice, however, a further threshold difficulty, that it would probably prove impossible to reach a reasonable degree of equality in this conception even by trial and error methods in a community whose members held very different and very deeply felt political theories about justice and distribution. For any distribution of goods we might arrange, some group passionately committed to a different distribution for reasons of political theory might be profoundly dissatisfied no matter how well they fared personally. En plus, il est américain, non? Il est pas anglais, Dworkin? Je sais plus. While others might be very pleased because they held political theories that approved the results. But because I propose to ignore practical or contingent difficulties, I shall assume a society in which it is possible to achieve rough equality in the amount by which people's unrestricted preferences were fulfilled, that is roughly equal success on this wide conception, either because people all hold roughly the same political theories, or because, though they disagree, anyone's dissatisfaction with a solution on political grounds could be made up by favoritism in his personal situation, without arousing so much antagonism in others as to defeat equality so conceived for that reason. This latter possibility, that people who lose out because their political theories are rejected could be given more goods for themselves by way of compensation, makes this conception of equality of welfare immediately unattractive, however. Even people otherwise attracted to the idea of equality of welfare, on any conception, would presumably not wish to count gains or losses in welfare traceable to, for example, racial prejudice. So I assume that almost everyone would wish to qualify equality of success at least by stipulating that a bigot should not have more goods than others in virtue of the fact that he would disapprove a situation in which blacks have as much as whites unless his own position was sufficiently favored to make up the difference. But it is unclear why this stipulation should not apply to all political theories that are in conflict with the general ideal of equality of success, and not just to racial bigotry. It should apply equally to people who think that aristocrats should have more than plebs, or to meritocrats who think that, as a matter of political morality, those who are more talented should have more. Indeed, it should apply even to egalitarians who think that people should be equal in resources or enjoyment or in the success each has in his personal life, rather than in the fulfillment of all his preferences, including his political preferences. These wrong egalitarian theories will of course seem more respectable to officials who have accepted the latter conception of equality than will bigoted or meritocratic theories. But it still seems odd that even wrong egalitarians should have extra resources credited to their personal account just to make up for the fact that their overall approval of the situation would otherwise be lower than those who hold the political theory assumed to be correct, and on which any claims the former might make to extra resources must in some sense rely. It seems odd, among other reasons, because a good society is one that treats the conception of equality that society endorses not simply as a preference some people might have, and therefore as a source of fulfillment others might be denied who should then be compensated in other ways, but as a matter of justice that should be accepted by everyone because it is right. Such a society will not compensate people for having preferences that its fundamental political institutions declare it is wrong for them to have. As a threshold. En fait, papa m'a demandé de regarder les tarifs les moins chers, si je pouvais regarder les tarifs les moins chers entre le 20 et le 23 juillet pour partir de Paris à Lorient, pour le rejoindre à Lorient. Il veut qu'on se partage le billet. Bien. The reason why racial bigotry should not count as a justification for giving the bigot more in personal goods is that this political theory or attitude is condemned by the proper conception of equality, not that the bigot is necessarily insincere or unreflective or personally wicked, but then other forms of non-egalitarian political theory and even misconceived forms of egalitarian theory should be discounted in the same way. Suppose, moreover, that no one has a non-egalitarian or wrong egalitarian political theory of any form or sort, but that some people are merely selfish and have no political convictions, even in the extended sense, so that their overall approval of the state of affairs after any distribution is just a matter of their own private situation, while others are benevolent so that their overall approval is increased by, say, the elimination of poverty in the society. Unless we refuse to take that benevolence into account as a positive source of success in meeting the preferences overall of those who are benevolent, we shall end once again by giving those who are selfish more for themselves to compensate for the success others have from that benevolence. But it is surely a mark against any conception of equality that it recommends a distribution in which people have more for themselves the more they disapprove or are unmoved by equality. Consider finally a different situation. Suppose no one holds in any case very deeply any formal political theory, but each generally benevolent. Many people, however, by way of what I call the political theory in the extended sense, sympathize especially with the situation of one group of those less fortunate than themselves, say orphans, and have special preferences that these be looked after well. If these preferences are allowed to count, this must have one or the other of two results. Either orphans will, just for this reason, receive somewhat better treatment than equality would itself have required in the absence of these special preferences, at the inevitable expense of other groups, including those disadvantaged in other ways, such as, say, cripples, or if this is ruled out on egalitarian grounds, those who care more about orphans than about cripples will be given extra resources to make up for the failure to fulfill this discrete preference, which extra resources they then may or may not contribute to orphans. Neither of these results does credit to an egalitarian theory. So we have good reason to reject the unrestricted conception of equality of success by eliminating from the calculation of comparative success both formal and informal political preferences, at least for communities whose members differ in these political preferences, which is to say for almost all actual communities with which we might be concerned. We might just pause to consider, however, whether we must reject that conception for all other communities as well. Imagine a community in which people by and large holds the same political preferences. If these common preferences endorse equality of success, including success in political preferences, then that theory for all practical purposes collapses into the more restricted theory that people should succeed equally in their non-political preferences.